All right. Welcome to another episode, everyone. I have a guest today. His name is Zach Wright, and I'm really excited to have him on. He actually works with FAIR, and I don't know. I really like having conversations across different divides. I talk about it all the time, but a lot of times I don't um, have the opportunity to talk to people necessarily. So um, I guess I want you to be able to introduce yourself for a little while. So, yeah, if you want to tell people a little bit about yourself, what you've done with FAIR and how you got involved, or yeah, anything you want to tell the listeners.
Well, sure, I'm happy to do that. So I'm going to make one quick correction, though. I feel the need to clarify this sometimes because whenever I go on to interviews, sometimes people have this tendency to like associate me as like representing FAIR as an organization, which is a little weird because as you can see, I'm not terribly experienced, and I do think it's a little odd when they try to say, they try to associate my words with her. So I'm not representing FAIR, but you're right in the sense that I have taken a lot of. FAIR's been kind enough to allow me to use their platform, do a couple podcasts. But anyway, I'm Zach.
I feel the same way with Mormon discussions, just so you know.
We're in
Okay,
the same
sorry.
boat then.
Yeah, go ahead.
But yeah, I'm Zach. It's a pleasure to be here. I've heard lots of good things about you. Of course, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I was born in the church. I served a mission during COVID, which has given me a lot of, it's given me a lot of fun stories. I don't know if we'll go too deeply into it, but I, besides that, I've just been back, and I am deeply interested in LDS theology and history. I think it's been interesting as I've dived more deeply into it. It's just gotten more fascinating to me, and so I'd taken some time both before and on my mission just to look more deeply into my faith, why I believe, that sort of thing. And while I certainly make no claims to omniscience, I was able to learn a couple of cool things, and I like sharing it with people when they like listening to me go on and on until their eyes roll to the back of their head or something like that. But I started working with FAIR maybe a year ago, maybe a little bit more than that. They were looking for volunteers, and I like the idea of being able to serve in my community, and so I asked if they would be willing to let me do stuff with them. And I was fully expecting, mind you, that they were just going to put me in some kind of like tech position or some kind of
Mhm.
like behind the scenes sort of thing. But as kind of a random side note, I had submitted some of the papers I had written on my mission, just as kind of like personal notes for me. So
Okay.
I was like, I figure I might as well send them so I can kind of get a general idea of like how I roll and kind of how I think and that sort of thing. I thought it would be helpful.
Just kind of like an essay or like
Well, sure.
brief.
It wasn't so much like a personal essay about my life as much as it was like an essay of my exploration of a specific topic.
Okay. What
So I think the
topics?
one
I'm
I had
curious.
done was like an essay I'd written on the gold plates,
Okay.
something like that. And they took one look at that, like, hey, you want to do a podcast for us? And I was like, wait, you guys saw I'm like 23, right? And I was not expecting them to come back to me with that response. But as I thought about it, I was like, you know what? I I'm kind of a more reserved person outside of like these interviews and sort of thing, and I didn't love the idea of putting myself out there, but I figured it would be a good way for me to practice being able to communicate effectively, and also just being able to like serve my community is always a plus, and so I figured it would be a good way to kind of put myself out there.
Okay. Cool. All right. So I want to tell people I listened to a couple of episodes from two different series that you've done. The first one that you did with Fair was By Study and by Faith.
Yeah.
That's a series on critical thinking. And then
Which
the
episodes did you listen to?
I listened to the very first one, like not all the way through, because
Mm.
I'm just scatterbrained and I feel like I never
Me
finish
too.
things.
It's all
It was
right.
pretty close to the end though. I think I might have finished that one. But anyway, and then you did Me, Myself, and I, clever title.
I thought you'd
And
like that.
and You did, and the one that I saw on that one, you had co-hosts. Did you have
Mhm.
co-hosts throughout the whole episode, or is it just maybe the one that I saw?
So for the first episode, I think we had co-hosts through the entire episode. I'd have to go back and listen to it. Honestly, it's been a while since we've recorded it to the
Mhm.
tune of months. But the well, we typically what happens is we have like intros and outros where all of us are kind of like sitting together and discussing, and then most of the episode is like one person talking about stuff they've listened to. Now, granted, the other two people are listening in; they've read the quotes. You like hear like voiceovers of them reading the quotes, so all of us are actively participating. But for the most part, it's us just kind of like talking about specific a specific topic. So the most recent kind of short series, or like the first volume, if you will, of episodes was on seer stones, how they're how objects are portrayed in the biblical texts, how people saw them throughout history, kind of like how that plays into Joseph Smith's culture, and kind of like what we're supposed to make of it
Mhm.
as people who still believe in God. And it's told from the perspective of, hey, we're not scholars. We don't have like degrees in history or theology or that sort of thing. But it's just kind of us taking a crack at what we can figure out just by looking over some sources. And we try to have a little bit of fun along the way. The goal is that we want to talk about the sort of thing, make it easier to talk about. So we try to be a little less formal than maybe like other conferences or venues that people or fair has been associated with. But I think it's been for what it's trying to accomplish. I think it's doing a pretty good job.
Okay. Um, and then you have some interview type ones I saw titles of, or like
Mm.
the thumbnail for. Are they still same format where you have the same co-hosts and then you have another additional person, or are
Uh,
those just the newer episodes?
those are a couple of newer episodes.
Okay.
So the two interviews I know you're talking about. One of them is with a guy by the name of Alan Hansen, who's like a Hebrew scholar. And the other one is with a BYU history professor named Garrett Dirkmott.
Okay.
And I know for a fact that Garrett Dirkmott has another podcast, the Standard of Truth podcast, but he's just like a historian, and we use their insights every now and again to help us talk about what we're researching,
Mhm.
because we like the idea of being able to make sure that we're aligning with the facts and trying not to go beyond the data that we have. And so we have a couple of ways of trying to do that, and the interviews have been fun. Most of the time, it's just one person interviewing. Um, More recently, we've done another interview with a rather notable LDS historian, and I got so excited that I said, "Hey, I want to help interview too." And so they were kind enough. So there are two people in that one, and you'll see that soon enough. But it hasn't been published yet, I don't think.
Okay. In your first series, By Study and by Faith, it was, I can't
Mhm.
remember how many episodes, like 8 episodes maybe, or
10 in
10
total.
episodes. Okay. And it's like finished then. You're not adding to it or anything. It's kind of a complete
For
uh,
now, yeah.
production. Okay. So you
I
might
um
add to it.
I might add to it, but
Okay.
the purpose of that one is a little bit different. Like I wanted to be able to explore critical thinking skills and
Hmm.
see if we could practice them on LDS theology and history.
Okay.
And so that's kind of the approach I take.
Okay. And then Me, Myself, and I, that is like that one's you're still releasing episodes on that one.
Yes.
Okay. Just curious, like as you've like been producing content, like have you liked it? Are you going to keep doing it? Do you like have other projects that pop into your head that you're like, oh, we should do this? Or I'm just kind of curious if
I don't know.
you're doing what you're doing and you like it so far, so you're just going to keep doing it. I'm just kind of curious about like I don't know, the back side of it.
Well, a lot of what happens, or I was talking with a buddy of mine about this recently, where they're like, well, what do you do? I was like, well, I typically take what I'm doing, because I do a lot of my own research independently. So it's not
Okay.
like, that's why I always kind of get weirded out when people talk about like me being associated with FAIR, because a lot of it is basically me doing my own stuff.
Hmm.
And then I think to myself, well, I wonder if FAIR would be interested in publishing this. So I go to them and I'm like, hey, do you want this? And they're like, yes. And then I'm like, all right, cool. And they're
Okay.
probably looking at it from the perspective of, hey, free labor. And as many volunteer organizations do, mind you, I don't think it's not
Yeah.
malicious in any way. I
Right.
doubt that. But that's that's kind of how it goes, where I'm doing my own thing, and I like producing content because it helps me kind of channel my thoughts. I
Okay.
view writing as kind of helping me focus and helping me kind of organize ways to organize material in a way I find to be useful that I can,
Mhm.
and being having something to distribute and give other people who have questions is also helpful. So
Yeah. Okay. So I'm curious, uh, the topics that you're like studying personally then, like what, um, it's just what is catching your attention at that time, or are
yeah,
you like following the, I don't know, the curriculum going on in church, or like, I'm just curious how, or you have like a list of things you kind of want to work on, and once you figure this one out, then you're doing the next thing, or I don't know. How do you decide?
well, you see, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but what you see is that's where the scatterbrained thing comes into play. So it really does kind of depend on what my interest is in. For a long time, what happened is that people would ask me questions. This was especially the pattern on my mission. People would ask me questions, and I would do research according to to those questions. When I got back on my mission, I would look into like psychology stuff,
Mhm.
and I would just kind of like associate that. That's why I was super excited to do the critical thinking podcast. I think that with critical thinking in particular, it's a little bit tricky because at least me growing up, I remember people always trying to talk about critical thinking skills, but I never really felt like both in my time in like the school system, I ever really like got like a firm grasp on what it was.
Mhm.
It was like this elusive goal far into the distance.
Yeah.
And we were always striving towards that point, but I can never really, we never really talked about what it meant, or at least not directly.
Yeah.
And so I look at my research style as being able to look at questions people have, me recognizing a need and wanting to be able to look into that specific question so that when other people I know have questions about a topic in psychology or even like a topic around church history or theology or that sort of thing, I can look at different ways people have tried to reconcile the issue and come to my own conclusions about it. So
Yeah.
it's very much something is interesting. People have questions about something, and then I look into it, and I'm able to either help them or kind of discuss what's available already. So that's kind of the approach. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Like you talked a lot about curiosity and asking questions in that first episode, and that seems to
Mm-hmm.
be like the front end of you delving into some of these topics. I as I was thinking about that, what you were saying about, well, people talk about critical thinking, but then you don't really understand what they're saying. I'm wondering if you think that's from bad teaching, like you didn't get the right education, or if you think that's just you can't learn it without the life experience.
Um, is both an acceptable answer?
Well,
Uh, uh,
if it's both, I'd be curious how you think. Like, I have kids, right? And I'm like, how do you teach kids critical thinking? Like, you can tell them something, but unless they're in like a situation where they do a 180 on something because they see something differently, or until you have that moment of, uh, I don't know, that it's hard to learn until you've like been wrong on something, like I don't know, but it's just
no,
a
that
thought
was well
that I had.
said. That was well said. Well, there's probably something to be said about like teachers, being obliged to follow a specific curriculum.
Yeah.
Um, and while they can talk about critical thinking skills, there's obviously more stuff that they're supposed to be trying to cover, and that stuff they're trying to cover is what they're being graded on, is my understanding. And
That's true.
so I don't want, maybe referring to them as being bad teachers. Maybe that's not fair, and I don't want to like call it. I
Yeah,
don't want to
yeah, but I
demean
understand.
that noble
Maybe something
profession.
different. Like, it's really easy to teach students probably what to think. It's harder to teach them how to think.
Right.
And you almost have to give them an experience. Maybe it's still in a classroom setting that you could teach in ways that allow them to have those experiences without just talking at them, right? So there possibly are ways to teach critical thinking in like high school, but anyway, it was just a thought that I had.
No, and it's an interesting thought, and there's probably something to be said that in the same way that you can say, if a teacher is trying to teach a student that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4,
Yeah.
how much of that is the teacher being able to explain the concept, and how much is it the student being able to actually make those logical connections inside their head? Because
Right.
math is a reason based process, and so
Mm-hmm.
it's very much an internal process. It can't really give that understanding to someone in the same way that you can like tell somebody what year the Declaration of Independence was signed, right?
Sure.
And so the process there, I think, is a little bit different. And with critical thinking skills, there's probably something to be said about being able to not only explain the principles and have them explained to you well, but also there's probably something to be said about being able to put that into practice, which is what I hope to be able to do within the episodes that
Mhm.
I produced on,
Yeah.
yeah, on the topic.
Um, okay, so one of the thoughts that I had about critical thinking is it seems like everyone seems to think that the truth or the best critical thinking applications are in favor of the view that like we hold, like whoever I am.
Mm.
Like I view my worldview as being supported by critical thinking, right? And you don't really I don't think anybody would say, "Yeah, I don't use critical thinking," right? Everybody feels like they have critical thinking on their side. And I've heard a lot of people that leave the church, for example, they'll express that they've um they followed their critical thinking and that's where it led them is right. It's led them out of the church. But I'm sure I'm hearing you express the same thing in your episodes that you're using critical thinking um and it's pointing you toward where you're at, right? So
Right.
I don't know. I guess I'm just like, how I don't know. How do you know if you're applying critical thinking to the best way to get to a view of the world that most aligns with reality? I guess uh, is another way of saying of that it's true, right? Like the one, right? And isn't that
Right.
what a good definition of truth is the one that aligns with reality the best?
Right. And no, I see where you're coming from. So just to make sure I understand the question correctly, though, we're wondering, we notice that people say that they're using critical thinking skills, but if everyone is using the same critical thinking skills, then why do people come to different conclusions?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So I've thought about this. Um, I have a couple of ideas as to why, and maybe it'd be nice to bounce some of them off of you, and I'd love to hear your insights on them.
Okay.
But when I look at it, there are a couple of factors I think that are at play. So one of them, in the first episode, I believe I talk about worldviews, right? Where I talk about things like the historical worldview and like the historical method. I also talk about things like the scientific method or the scientific world. I use the term worldview and method kind of interchangeably there. I might have to go back and do that, but to talk about that a little bit more, I think I might have phrased it a little bit differently. But my
Like
initial
different
thought,
domains, I think you
yeah.
used.
So each method has their own um, each method has their own questions that they are equipped to answer. So, for instance, the realm of history is able to go back through the records of ancient peoples or not so ancient peoples and eventually arrive at conclusions to they're able to arrive at conclusions that we wouldn't be able to arrive at using any other worldview. In the analogy I use is you don't want to use a hammer to mow your lawn.
Mm-hmm.
So you wouldn't want to use the scientific method per se, or the scientific method may not be as helpful as maybe the historical method to answer questions about, again, going back to like what year the Declaration of Independence was signed. And so I that's one thing. And then so application of different worldviews in different venues is a part of it, specifically because we as people apply those worldviews and in different ways and at different times to answer questions. And so when we're looking, and we sometimes apply the methods within those worldviews. So we sometimes apply. So the second episode on my critical thinking series is about evaluating sources in history, right?
Hmm.
So there are different ways historians like look at different documents. So, for example, they try to focus on primary sources. They want to focus on sources that are contemporary with the events they're describing. They want to look at corroborated details, that sort of thing. But there's always a little bit of give and take between what standards we're applying when. And there's a lot of gray area where people, you know, very, very intelligent people who are coming to different conclusions, very intelligent people come to different conclusions regarding a specific topic. So, for example, an example that pertains to LDS history is how historians within the church have viewed the happiness letter, for example. So, there are certain historians that I know, such as Garrett Dirkmott, who I mentioned recently. Mm-hmm. He doesn't believe the happiness letter is a direct document from Joseph Smith. And he has his own reasons as to why, and he's applying, well-credited and well-established historical principles to arrive at that conclusion. But then you also have other historians like Don Bradley, who view the happiness letter as being legitimate. And the way that they're able to arrive at those conclusions, they're applying the same methods of historical analysis, and heaven knows they're both very skilled at what they do. Mm-hmm. But the way that they are applying the rules within those worldviews naturally and inevitably, I would argue, lead to different conclusions. And so that what I think is another factor that helps to explain why there are differing opinions. Mm-hmm. And even differing opinions among people who who may just be equally as intelligent. It's not a question of, am I smarter than the person sitting across from me? It's a question of, how are we applying these principles in a way that can help us understand more about the world?
Yeah.
And nowhere is that trickier than in the realm of religion and politics.
Yeah.
And specifically because with religions and religious experience, particularly, a lot of it boils down to our own moral intuitions and how we experience the world as a result. Mm-hmm. And so when hold on, I want to make sure I don't lose track of your question, because we were talking about
you're getting it right on, like why people come to different conclusions, right?
Right. So we're talking
we're all
about
using critical thinking skills. We're all intelligent, right? We're not all. I'm not necessarily. You have maybe two people that are intelligent.
I am presupposing that everybody is acting in good faith and people are equally intelligent. Sometimes in the world that's messy, and in social media it's messier. Yeah. But
a lot of people are losing hope in having good faith conversations too. They're like, they're not good faith, so I'm not going to be good faith either. And then it kind of spirals out of control. But yeah, we can have that assumption here.
Well, obviously, Marty, you disagree with me, so I can't listen to anything you say.
That's right.
But the point I'm trying to get across, though, is that particularly with religious experience, they're being filtered through things like culture, through our own our own brain capacity, through things like evolution. And I would attribute at least our moral intuitions come at least in part through the spirit. Mm-hmm. But I would be, by necessity, that is an imposition I am placing upon my own intuition, where I wouldn't necessarily be able to prove that the spirit is affecting my intuition any more than I would be able to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that, there is a God that does exist. But religious experience is always also being filtered through our intuitions, and that's always going to lead to differing conclusions. Mm-hmm. And we should be willing to take that into account when we're discussing bearing our testimonies, or why people, why there are so many different religions, why people have testimonies of different religions as a result, and also why well-meaning, well-intentioned, well-informed people all come to different conclusions.
Yeah. I like that your example, though. You were even using people that agree fundamentally. They probably have very similar moral fundamental beliefs, and they still came to different conclusions about a piece of historic document, right? So that I like that you used that example.
And hopefully I was able to kind of address some of that question, because you make a really, really good point. And it's the fact that we disagree is naturally going to lead to conflict. Yes. And that's where we as critical thinkers need to be we need to be aware where the conflict is, and we need to be aware what the information is, and we also need to be aware on how to interact with people to resolve the
Mhm.
conflict. Because if we don't, then we end up in echo chambers, and it's not pretty.
Yeah, and I've come to conclusions that the best way to get over some of those things is to stay out of echo chambers, which is nearly impossible to do because that's where we want to be and that's where we're comfortable. So,
Well, it feels
and I'm
nice
not
when
and
everyone's
I'm not
agreeing with you,
necessarily.
right?
Huh? Sorry.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I
You're
was
good.
I was just saying it feels nice when everyone agrees with you, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's just the natural place where we want to be. And so, um, but I do feel like uh maintaining relationships across difference divides helps you realize that you can disagree with people and without thinking that we disagree with this person, therefore they must fall short in one of a few ways. They either must be not informed, right? They must be dumb, or they must be dishonest, or they, like, another extreme one is that they must be evil. Like, um, and I don't think I think we're driven a lot. I think sometimes even our personalities is enough to help lead us to different conclusions. You know, like if you are, um, I think politically, I think that is what it motivates a lot of people. Like if you have a personality where you're like, I'm going to lift myself up by my bootstraps, you're going to probably lean more conservative. Or if you are really heavy and empathetic, like empathy, you're probably going to lean toward the left. Like it just seems to me like, and I think it takes both of those types of personalities working together to actually create a better society. So the fact that we're like dividing out and not talking to each other is not great.
No, I agree with
So
you. And
yeah.
Jonathan Haidt, maybe you've probably
Oh yeah,
heard
I
of
love
him.
Jonathan
Yeah,
Haidt.
Jonathan Haidt's great. Like
Yeah.
his moral foundations, um, his moral foundations framework, I think is really really good.
Yeah.
It has received some criticism, admittedly. Ironically, most of the criticism I've seen has come from people who lean more liberal,
Oh, interesting.
because they would. There's a Psychology Today article I was reading a while ago. They was kind of talking about it, but it was for the most part, I think it is a useful model, and
Mhm.
I I think there's merit to what you're describing on how differences between individuals can account for some of the reasons that we come to differing conclusions.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. Um so anyway, I it's I guess it makes me sad when I see interactions and it devolves into that. Like they're like, "Oh, they're just not good faith." How quickly people throw that accusation out, or how quickly people throw out, well, they're just an idiot, or um everyone thinks the other person is biased, but they're not, right? And
Well,
I just,
yeah,
yeah, and I just find like as far as um having those relationships or having, you can't control another person. You can't make another person see your point of view, but you can try to learn how to listen better and you can try to understand other people better. And so I find like the relationship, mm, improving relationships, if you look at it as like a self improvement um, endeavor, I think things are going to get better because you can control you, but you can't control the other people that you're around. And that's the best you can do. And I've found personally that when I've done that, it's almost always reciprocated. So, um, yeah. Anyways, I I'm trying to think of the next segue. I had something there. I lose my train of thought a lot. I'm really sorry.
no, you're just fine. You're just
have
fine.
I have my thought. So, um, one thing you talked about in, I think it was the, yes, it was the by study and by faith episode.
Mhm.
You were talking about different domains, and you talked about the spiritual domain. I'd be curious to know what different domains there are in your view, and what you can learn in one domain, and can they cross? Can you learn something in one domain and then it? How do I word this? Like if you have a spiritual domain, you probably have different methods of learning things in your spiritual domain, right?
Mhm.
And you would be trying to apply those things differently than, say, the scientific method over in a scientific domain, or like where would that fit in, I guess?
So that's a good question, and that's something I didn't explain very well in my
I
episode.
just
And
figured it
so
wasn't because I didn't listen to all of them.
no,
So,
no, no, and I like I said, of all the episodes, I think I did a good job for what I was trying to do in introducing the series. But
okay.
that's one thing where I wish I had gone a little bit more into detail.
Okay.
And so I look at the domains as all being, at least in some degree, interconnected. Whether we recognize those connections or not, there is at least some degree of connection between them. So, for
Okay.
example, in the when we're talking about, let's see, economics, for example, the economic worldview is focused on being able to interact. Like the point of economics is seeing, like, being able to exchange things for value, kind of. But that's like economics is of course, and economics and business is inherently related to psychology. And so there's obviously going to be some overlap
Sure.
between those two. And so when I look at things like the spiritual domain, I look at things as I look at the spiritual being able to overlap very strongly with psychology, of course,
Hmm.
but also with reason, which now reason, of course, is probably subordinate, at least to some degree, to our intuition. Jonathan Haidt talks about that.
Oh,
Um,
right.
with
The
like
elephant
the
and the
elephant,
rider.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's probably something to be said there. But what about like our sensory information? I know you did an episode with Jacob Hansen. He probably talked with you about his collective witness model, or if you've at least heard of it.
I don't think we got into that too much, but I am familiar with his collective witness model.
Sure, and that's okay. I'm not demanding encyclopedic knowledge, but one of the things he likes to talk about is this whole experience aspect,
Hmm.
and that's of course been affirmed by scholars who are LDS and non-LDS alike when talking about the spiritual. So but experience, of course, is related to psychology, but it's also inherently related to biology, like our sensory information. The whole idea behind sensation and perception also has like a biological component.
Mm.
Now, how closely biology and psychology are related, and how much biology controls our psychology, is up to debate. But that would be another example of like how different methods and how different worldviews, if you will, and like different tools that we have can interact with each other to solve problems. And what critical thinkers should do is they should be willing to take tools that exist in different domains, in different worldviews,
Hmm.
and apply them to solve problems that exist in the world.
Okay. So can so you've mentioned some of the different domains, and I guess it's not exhaustive. That you're just describing different fields of study as being a domain, then,
Well,
or
kind of. And for all intents and purposes, I think that's how I was viewing it. Because when I look at a domain, I classify them by by the tools that they have and they employ, and
mhm,
also their goals. So, for example, the historical worldview is focused on trying to learn about what happened in the past, and they use tools to solve that problem.
mhm,
And the scientific worldview is trying to establish the behavior outcomes of specific variables,
mhm,
and they have specific tools to be able to solve that problem. Now, the spiritual domain, I think, is a little bit more complicated though, because I would look at the spiritual domain as being, well, at least in LDS theology, there's a degree to which the spiritual domain is hypothetically interacting with all of the other different domains. Because depending on how literally you choose to take the whole, all spirit is matter kind of a thing that's present within the Doctrine and Covenants, you could try and apply that sort of those. You could try and apply the spiritual domain to just about any other domain.
mhm.
So I think there's a little bit of leeway, and the definition of domain and worldview I'm using is a little bit more fluid, and that's probably where some of your confusion is coming from, and I'm sorry about that.
Oh, there's no need for apology. I guess I mean, you've been around enough people that have left, and I'm sure have described to you what it's like to have that worldview shift, right?
Right.
And I don't think my guess is you already have heard the cynicism, maybe is the word, of the spiritual overriding some other worldview. Like if it's in conflict, and then you lean toward the spiritual instead, just because of confirmation bias, right? Like,
Right.
uh, I don't think I'm describing this very well.
That's all right. Take your time.
I guess my concern would be that the separating things out this way doesn't necessarily bother me. What worries me is that you, as a person, anybody, any individual, if they have this fallback domain, the spiritual domain, that it can be unreliable, um, and then lead you to conclusions that are not aligned with reality. So, um, and it kind of goes back to like the echo chamber stuff. Like, I see this kind of happening in like the political landscape and every landscape, really. It's not um, unique to like the religious view, but it's a similar story, I think, being told across lots of different people who are stepping away from their like childhood faiths. And so I don't know, like how do you address that for people when they have those questions? They're coming to you and they're like, hey, I don't know if this is like a good way to know things, like
Okay.
this spiritual domain, I guess.
Well, that's a good point. And just to make sure I understand, we're talking about how can we know if if the spiritual tools we are employing
Yeah,
are are actually going to lead us to correct conclusions.
sure. Yeah.
Okay. So that's a good question.
You
And it
say
goes
that so
back.
concisely. It took me like 3 minutes to spit
No,
that out, and you repeated it so well. Thank you.
I just want to make sure I'm actually addressing the question because
Yeah,
it's one that commonly, especially a lot of people my age have.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Um, my conclusion has been if we're talking about whether or not a tool is reliable, the only way to solve that problem is to actually use it and see what
Mhm.
happens and to consciously use it and keep track of the results that we find. And so, for example, if I rely on reason to try and establish conclusions
Mhm.
about like math, and I find that it is consistent and that it is useful and it helps me arrive at things that correspond, ideas that correspond to reality,
Mhm.
I can trust that it is reliable.
Mhm.
And so I think that's why when we're talking about things like the spirit, I would argue that in terms of LDS theology, the spirit has a few different ways that it can interact with us to help us arrive at correct conclusions. So, for example, um, like experience or behavior outcomes. So, the church, of course, teaches principles such as prayer. We'll use prayer as an example. And the argument that the church is trying to, the scriptures, and I would say that leaders try to employ is that when you pray and you do that consistently, you will be able to notice positive outcomes in your life. And you would then know, and the argument there is the spirit is the one that helps you arrive at those conclusions and helps you arrive at those positive outcomes.
Mhm.
And the same comes from intuition, right?
Yeah.
And and I would also I like to throw reason in there specifically because I think there's always a degree of there's always a degree wherein I believe critical thinking skills and certainty and sorry reason and logic can play into why we believe what we believe in a spiritual sense. So
Wait, can you
now,
explain that a little bit more?
sure. So there are a lot of claims in any kind of religion that are in a lot of ways unfalsifiable. So, for
Oh, right.
example, I can't prove that God exists per se.
Mhm.
I would need to employ other methods to help people arrive at that conclusion or to suggest that it is a reasonable conclusion to hold.
Okay.
And so that's the whole premise behind, I would say, like apologetics. So, for
Mhm.
example, they would the arguments that people would employ would be based on reason. It would be based on like empirical data, and using that empirical data and forming premises in such a way to where you would be able to arrive at a conclusion about something corresponding to reality. So, for example,
Like a way
um,
that it could be true.
a way that it could be true. So, for example, um, logic in a lot of ways in religious belief is really kind of focused on making sure that we don't hold spiritual beliefs that don't coincide with reality. So,
Right?
for example, um, people who believe that the Earth is 6,000 years old would want to structure empirical data that they find, or that's a common tactic I found. They structure empirical data that may or may not be true as a way to arrive to the conclusion that the Earth is flat, or
Mhm.
the Earth is 6,000 years old. Now, whether or not that is true, it can actually be determined by both, empirical data, behavior outcome, but also reason. It is the logic that they present, like premise A, premise B, and then conclusion. The premises do not support the conclusion, and so naturally, logic would be a tool that is used to disprove a claim.
Mhm.
Does that make more sense?
Yes. I guess I struggle a little bit with that because I'm sure there are some people that believe that the Earth is 6,000 years old and they feel like they are doing it. They have good premises and they have good logic and they have good reason and they still arrive to that conclusion, right?
Right.
So that's
So,
basically
okay.
you would be disagreeing on the premise, right? You would be
Right.
disagreeing with the foundational
But
uh,
that's exactly my
data.
point.
Okay.
So that's exactly my point. So logic is a tool that can be used to talk about metaphysical and to an extent spiritual claims. Because if you're saying a lot of the time when people talk about the earth being 6,000 years old, it's to support a specific interpretation of the biblical texts.
Hmm.
Namely, that, if you like run it back there, Adam was hypothetically existed back in 4,000 BC. Now, whether or not, I don't think that's what the biblical writers were trying to communicate when they were talking about it. There's more that can be said about biblical scholarship and its relationship to the biblical,
Yeah.
beliefs that exist both inside and outside the church. But my point in bringing this up is logic and reason is a tool that can be used to support a specific interpretation of scriptural texts, or it can be used as a way of rationalizing within ourselves, or also kind of analyzing beliefs that we hold because of our intuition. Right? That
Hmm.
goes back to the whole elephant thing, right?
Hmm.
Where our intuition has a specific um, it intuits something, it learns something, it has information delivered, and we're able to hold on to it and recall it. And then we can use reason to as a way to be able to either support or to dismiss intuition as that information that our intuition is providing us as being legitimate or not.
Yeah.
And so I would classify sources of spiritual information as being um, intuition, reason, and experience or behavior outcome.
Yeah.
And so, because I would argue that the spirit can work through those methods to help us arrive at specific conclusions. Now, the question at that point becomes, am I justified in attributing the spirit to working through those methods? And in reality, that's where I that at that point I have to choose to believe, or I have to ascribe those ideas, I have to ascribe that information as coming from the spirit. Now, if it was just once or twice, I would say, okay, this might just be me, or this might just be some kind of confirmation bias, or whatever that may be. But I would look at my beliefs, and I would say I'm trying to employ tools that I esteem to be reliable enough to come to a conclusion about God. So, for
Hmm.
instance, I would I would use reason and intuition and my experience with both the claims and the principles taught within the Book of Mormon to establish that it is, in fact, historical and it does come from God and is inspired. And I use those three tools as interplaying with each other to come to that conclusion while recognizing, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Joseph Smith was just this super smart con man who found a way to create the Book of Mormon, and he just duped millions of people for centuries now. But I I don't think that's the case though, and I have reasons for why I don't believe that's the case.
Right.
But those reasons are all foundationally based on my experiences, reason, and intuition, and the messiness that is inherent within each of those.
Mm-hmm.
And that messiness is why I would say that there's also differing conclusions and why people come to different conclusions about religious claims and, that sort of realm of philosophy.
Yeah. Um, so I wanted to go
Have I
back.
bored you enough yet, or am I?
No, not at all. There was a lot there. There's a lot of directions that I can go. I'd like to go this direction. So,
Okay, sure.
you were talking about behavior outcome.
Mm-hmm.
I guess when I look at, I think that's actually a pretty solid reason to keep acting like a Latter-day Saint. Like if you have a good life and you might have questions about something, and actually I love how you say in episodes, I've heard you say that you don't really like the idea of people just putting things on the shelf. Like you think that they should explore it and grow and learn. And
I there are reasons for that. It has to do with how I resolve cognitive dissonance personally. But
yeah.
go on.
Well, so I like that because I think that's true. I think there are ways that you can learn and grow. And I honestly, I see the path that I went down, and there is probably a path had I resolved some things earlier on that I might have not had such a huge shift in my life suddenly. Like had I been addressing things along the way and not just not willing to like address the thing, right? And it grew in the dark, the problem. So I think that's wise to address things when they're still small and manageable and not have such like a huge life altering uh, thing happen to you. Like I feel like having a collapse of belief is pretty life altering. Um, but anyway, going back to the behavior outcome, I don't actually have a problem with people using that as a tool and saying, okay, this is how I'm living my life. I'm applying this thing. It makes my life better. I'm going to keep doing that thing. I think that's sound advice. I think the thing that I struggle with is when people say, I'm going to apply this thing. It's helping me in my life. Therefore, there were gold plates. Like it's like it's taking something from like a behavioral experiential domain, if you will, and then it's going into like propositional claim that is more like you're making like I guess I
You're
don't
using a hammer to mow the lawn.
yeah, a little bit. And that's kind of what I see people do when they're bearing their testimony even is they'll say this makes my life better, and I'm not denying that it makes your life better. What is hard for me to hear is the conclusion that they make from that, and I'm not sure that the conclusion follows all the
You
time.
know, it doesn't follow. So logically speaking, I follow. I don't drink alcohol, therefore gospel true.
Yeah, right.
And I get frustrated with that too. So you're in good company. But I would go back to, okay, so in regards to how reason is employed, I would say that in terms of when I talk about the church being true, for example, I like using there's a really good book called Understanding Knowledge by Michael Huemer, and he talks a little bit about religious epistemology when he talks about knowledge. as like a principle, one of the robust models that he talks about is the divisibility theory of knowledge, wherein the philosophers say you can know something if it meets four different criteria: where you believe it, it corresponds to reality, it's true, you have justification for that belief, and there aren't any defeaters of that justification that are genuine. So when I say I know the church is true, I am saying I believe its truth claims, those truth claims I don't believe anything that doesn't correspond to reality, or I believe the truth claims correspond to reality. I believe that I have justification for those beliefs, and I haven't found anything that would destroy that justification for that belief.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I when I talk about those specific propositions, I would go into like different reasons and like different evidences, I would say, whether they come from like the internal intuition aspect or whether they come through my experience. And as a way I would stack it up together, I would use those sources as my justification for that belief. But you're right, though, in the sense that I don't want to use the wrong tool for the wrong job. In the same sense, I don't think, for example, when my typical go-to chapters in the Book of Mormon when I try to explain this to people in a more church setting is Alma 32 through 34, where Alma talks about experimenting upon the word. And as you experiment upon it, you begin to like notice there's a good seed within you, and that seems to be a good thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then you continue to do it, and the argument is that eventually you do it enough to where you know it's true. I would say that you know because of behavior outcomes that it's a good principle to live by.
Mm-hmm.
And my argument would be, if there was a God, I imagine that he would employ principles to where if there was a God that does care about us, he would want to teach us about principles that would be good. And a lot of it does boil down to, at least for me, if I imagined there was a God that does exist, because that's where I kind of started when I started looking into this. I was like, okay, if a God does exist, how would I be able to know that's true?
Mm-hmm.
And I, as I thought about it, I recognized a couple of different things. One, it's first off, it's really, really difficult to know if there is actually a spiritual domain. And a lot of it does boil down to, I think a lot of it does end up boiling down to whether or not a lot of it boils down to our psychological capacity to either classify or recognize things as being spiritual. And I came to the conclusion that if a God does exist, he would, and it was a God worth worshiping, in my opinion, in the sense that he loved us and he wanted us to be happy and he wants us to return to him. He would structure an institution in such a way to where he would structure the institution in such a way to where it would be beneficial to people in the long run. It would provide a good community. It would try to hold on to as much true principles as it could while rejecting bad ones.
Mm-hmm.
And as I examined LDS theology through that lens, I found that there were a plethora of examples wherein revelation was obtained via those three specific like sources. That's like experience, behavior, outcome, reason, and intuition. And the prophets, what they consistently try to do is they try to say, hey, these sources of information, you're recognizing they are good because of God. And I mean, that's the whole premise behind what Alma says, where Alma says, hey, this is the experiment upon the word. Now listen to all these prophets talk about Jesus Christ. Now listen to what happens when you pray. And as you do this sort of thing, you come to know it's true. And specifically in the context of knowing that Jesus is the Christ and knowing that we can learn more about him. But there's always going to be a degree of subjectivity there. And the point behind faith is we are establishing that causation in our minds about intuition, or we are. Hold on, I want to make sure I do this justice. Faith, in my view, is ascribing good principles and those moral intuitions in conjunction with the other foundational sources helping us learn what's true. We ascribe those things as coming from the Spirit, testifying that there is a God, that Jesus is the Christ, and that we can return back into his presence, and that God does care about us.
Can you give your definition of faith again?
Okay, sure. So faith is the choice. I would say that faith is a choice in the sense that it's a we are interpreting the data, or we are making a conscious choice to interpret the data in light of all the different information we have. We are interpreting our intuitions, talking about like specific moral principles or specific ideas about God. We are interpreting our intuition, our reason, our rational faculties, and our experiences as having come from God or the divine.
Hmm. That's interesting. So it kind of depends on your applying the thing with the choice that you're saying you're making a choice that there's a God as you act on these things, kind of, right?
So
Or am I not
I would
understanding?
say that those good principles are those our recognition that those are our recognition that living good principles is a good thing.
Uh-huh.
We are ascribing that recognition as coming from the Holy Ghost and consequently coming from God.
Interesting. Is there a way that you would see a secular person that is not attributing faith to a higher power, but that they would use faith in a sentence? Like, what would that mean?
So that's an interesting question. So specifically, I mean, I guess it depends on how this secular person would be viewing their own intuition, right? So for example, if you hold to like a hardcore deterministic model of psychology, where everything is determined based on our biology, our psychology, our culture, that sort of thing, then I think it would be a little bit difficult to have. The only thing you would be needing to have faith in that regard is I have faith that even though the molecules within me are deterministically being doing just kind of bouncing around a little bit, that the feelings I am feeling come from that. I can't see them, and maybe that's not what's going on, but I am ascribing that to be the reason why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling when I live these principles, or when I come to this conclusion, or think about X, Y, and Z thing.
Yeah, I find the deterministic discussions, maybe I should be more interested in them. I find them less interesting to me because people don't think about life being determined when they're living their daily life, right? Like when they're making the decisions that they make on a daily basis to...
You sound like Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan. If you've listened to my episodes, you know that.
Yeah, I do know that. It's
but I personally am just not like, I just don't, it doesn't, I mean, you can know that, and if it were true, it doesn't, it can give you a little more compassion for people, maybe. Like, you're like, oh, they are where they're at, maybe. I don't know. But as far as how I'm going to use that information, it doesn't seem to change how I act in the world, unless I become nihilistic, and then that seems like a less good path to go down too. I don't know.
Well, admittedly, that wouldn't be the first time someone has left the church and chosen nihilism. Admittedly, I mean,
well, I actually have my own blame on the church for that. I feel like that some of those, it's almost like you get trained. If the church is not true, then nothing is. Life's not worth living. Like, and that's like taught to you from a little kid, and so you're like, well, I don't want the life to be meaningless, so I'm just going to stay in the church. But then I feel like I learned that life can be meaningful outside the church, so it was okay.
It's really interesting you say that, because I've had a very, very different experience.
No.
And so I would appeal back to like different conference talks given. There was one that was recently given by Elder Uchtdorf that I really liked, where he talked about people, outside the church, or people who don't have faith, living really, really happy lives. And he was like, he said it in the context of, he believes that God created a really nice world for everyone to live in, and it would make sense that people would be able to find happiness outside the church. And I really liked that. I think it makes
I
sense.
I shouldn't put the blame totally on the church. I should put it on theists in general. Like, I think theism, like, because Christians have that kind of same line of thinking. Like, well, if there is
Okay,
no God, then therefore there's no meaning in life. And
and
I'm,
that
I don't know
doesn't
if you're,
follow, in my opinion.
yeah, like if I don't know if you're familiar with John Vervaeke's work. I actually kind of wanted to
No,
go
I'm not.
back a little bit to the ways of knowing. So this is a good segue to go back a little bit, but um, I really like his model of there's like four types of knowing. There's the propositional type of knowing, which is, you know, there are this many molecules in this whatever in this material, and then there's like perspectile knowing, and I have to look it up so that I can do it justice here. So like perspective is knowing what it's like from your angle, right? Like to know what something's like from a certain angle. And then there's like procedural knowledge, which is sequences, skills, activity, like how to play baseball. You know, you can learn how to play baseball from a book, but you don't really know how to play baseball until you like practice and you learn the skills. And then there's participatory knowing, which is um, like relationships and playing a certain role in your environment because you're actually participating. And I guess I like that. And I guess I struggle with there isn't like that distinction. I didn't just grow up knowing those distinctions. And so then you start to get like cognitive dissonance because you're like, well, I know the church is true, but I don't know what that means. And so then you start feeling like, how did I feel like the church was good, but now I'm not thinking that, you know, some of those propositional claims are true. Like those are the things that are not true to me anymore. But as I was living the gospel, as I was participating in the gospel and living in that community, it was obviously like I had good feelings there. And so and something was true there. Like when I bore my testimony when I was a member and I said, I know the church is true, I knew something was good and true. Um, and I guess that's I guess I wonder if, um, and this is definitely influenced by Jordan Peterson, but that religion kind of became propositionally true as we developed like scientific method and stuff like that and started making propositional claims. And so people knew that their religions were true, and so they started reading the text in a propositional way when maybe they were never meant to be read like that. And so I know it feels, if you're talking to someone that they have their religious claims that they have faith in and they live by it, they don't like to hear that it's only metaphorically true, right? Like that doesn't feel like there's not quite a right word for it. But I guess what are your thoughts in people that are resolving their faith crises in that way, where they're like, okay, I can't make the propositional leap. Like, do you feel like you have to be on board with the propositional claims of there being physical gold plates um, and you know those the propositional claims like the historic Book of Mormon? I'm trying to think of other things that seem fundamental to, like, you have to have these ordinances like literally to return to the presence of God. Like they actually are needing to be done. Like if you're stepping back and you're like, well, I think ritual is important. This is my religion of my family, of my heritage, of my ancestors. I want to continue practicing this, but I can't be on board with the propositional claims. But I believe I believe it's true in these other ways. Like I'd be curious to know what you think of that point of view.
So I would say yes, you can, but the question at that point becomes, are you willing to accept the following battles that happen after that? So, for example, if I was to say, for example, that I didn't believe the Book of Mormon was true just because I didn't like X, Y, and Z things, and anachronisms, DNA, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
I chose then to come to I came to the conclusion through using like the sources we talked about earlier
Hmm.
that I propositionally speaking, or well, I couldn't find
Or
reasons
maybe you're
to believe it was true.
agnostic
Well, okay,
propositionally.
sure. Well, we'll say I don't know if the Book of Mormon is
Yeah.
propositionally true, and so I'm just going to live by its own principles. And I think I can just kind of be like that. I think you can do that.
Hmm.
The question at that point becomes, okay, so if I don't believe the Book of Mormon is propositionally true, then how did Joseph Smith, how did we get the Book of Mormon narrative as we have it? Did Joseph Smith just make it up? Did he get his information from somewhere else, like other books, or did he just was he just this creative genius and like made it all up himself using his like own understanding of the biblical text at the time and
Hmm.
kind of mixing it up? And so
Well,
these
certainly you believe that, I mean, all of his influences up to that point still helped him write the Book of Mormon. Like, whether it was literally inspired by God or not, like, he still had other influences that certainly
sure,
helped him.
I, I would certainly say that the Book of Mormon is certainly a 19th century translation, if nothing else, where it
Yeah.
would be it's clothed in religious language that Joseph Smith would have been familiar with.
Hmm.
It uses concepts and words that certainly wouldn't have existed when Nephi or Mormon are writing the contents down, assuming they do
Hmm.
exist. And I you're absolutely right when they're saying there is something to be said about the 19th century verbiage and influence that may have been imposed upon the text by Joseph Smith while translating.
Hmm.
But my point, more specifically, by bringing this up, is talking about okay, so you're applying this specific idea to try and reconcile cognitive dissonance you feel about propositional knowledge about the Book of Mormon being true. But as a result, I would argue that regardless of what you do, even if you were to do that, you end up having to resolve cognitive dissonance in other places as well. Specifically, like, did Joseph Smith make this up? Or did he believe it was coming from God, but it wasn't really just him?
Hmm.
Or there are lots of different ways, and we have to you inevitably end up running into conflicts in other places regarding our theology. Because if you come to the conclusion, for example, that um, Joseph Smith, believed that all of this was coming from God and then implemented rituals as a way to connect with God, then at that point it becomes really, really difficult for you to justify um, kind of saying everybody should live by these kind of rituals or principles. Because,
So you're saying it's like it loses its authoritative pull then.
sure, yeah, and that might be, I'd have to think about that. Hold on. Because I'm not entirely sure if you know what? Actually, authority might be a good way to put it because we're ascribing that sort of thing as being authoritative because you know things like the endowment, for example, allegedly come from God. And if you
Hmm.
don't believe that Joseph Smith was actually able to communicate with God, then I don't know
Well, and
if you
then
have a lot of
Christ's gospel is restored too, right? That's
right.
one of the
And
fundamental
so
claims as
that's
well.
another foundational thing.
Hmm.
And so while I would say yes, you can find a way to you can find a way to believe that, for example, that there weren't gold plates or that the Book of Mormon wasn't a historical record. I just think that you solve problems at the expense of creating new ones,
Hmm.
and that happens for every single religion, I would say. And
Yeah, I'm not
I
sure
would say
anybody lives free of problems, right?
I don't think there is.
Yeah.
And the question at that point becomes, what problems do you want to have?
Hmm.
And I'm speaking, of course, under the assumption that a lot of this stuff is super cut and dry anyway.
Hmm.
And that's not always true for religious claims. My point being, though, is I would agree with you in the sense that I absolutely believe it's possible, and I would even dare say that there may even be a place in the church for people who don't believe that there were actually gold plates, or people
Hmm.
who don't believe that um, there was an actual Moroni who visited Joseph Smith, or there may be a place for them. My only concern is I'm not entirely sure what that would look like in terms of them being able to reconcile other problems they may have or other problems that may come up while on their own faith journey.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the path I tried to take toward the end of my participating in the church. Is I
Hmm.
was like, I think it's more important how you act. Like if I act like the church is true, that's more important than actually knowing like what does it even mean to say that I think the church is true? If I thought the church was true, then I'd act a certain way, and I tried to continue to act that way. Um, and you're right. Participating, it's really hard. You have to almost change the language that people are using and convert it in your head, and then that becomes its own problem. Like you're right. It is difficult to play that game, and I'm sure there's people that are doing it. Um,
I know people who are doing it.
yeah, and and I don't know. It's just an interesting thought experiment. Um, just because I was curious where you, because I think there are people that are practicing Latter Day Saints that have strong opinions one way or the other, and so I was just curious, kind of where you felt, and
And
so it's interesting to hear your response.
and I hope that I'm doing them justice. I would certainly never want to like do anything that would offend anybody when talking about that. And I personally do believe that the Book of Mormon is in fact an ancient document. I think it's authentically ancient, and I believe that the events in there, um, to the extent that ancient records can be reliable,
Hmm.
I would say that there is that it is authentically ancient, and that Joseph Smith was telling the truth about how he got it, and actually had power given to him by God to translate the record. And I
Hmm.
have my own reasons for that, and I have my own ways of reconciling problems and questions people may have about the Book of Mormon actually being anciently authentic. But my methods, by necessity, are aren't always going to translate one for everyone else. Because again, going back to that example I gave earlier about being able to analyze documents even within the church,
Hmm.
very intelligent people can come to different conclusions with the exact same set of data.
Hmm.
And I don't want to be the kind of person that shoves people away from faith in an attempt to be able to prove that my way is the only way to understand the data that we have.
Hmm.
But I also have to acknowledge the fact that when people make those kinds of decisions, or when people study the information and come to conclusions about either it being true or it being not truly anciently authentic,
Hmm.
there, regardless of what you do, you're going to end up running into additional problems with that worldview.
Yeah.
And I I have found a lot of comfort, and I think that there is decent evidence, at least in part, to support my conclusion that the Book of Mormon is authentically ancient. But people who don't believe the Book of Mormon is authentically ancient don't have to wrestle with the same problems I do,
Hmm.
or you do, or whatever the case may be.
Hmm.
So we have to pick and choose our battles. And that's also one of the reasons I get really kind of frustrated when people accuse members of the church of being cafeteria Mormons. You've probably heard that.
Well,
Because,
I think it's something you notice as you grow up a little bit and you have more experience, and it is looked at as like a negative thing, but I think it's just a reality thing.
it's a reality thing.
It's a
We are
growing up thing.
cafeteria people.
Yeah.
And whether we realize we're in the cafeteria during lunch hour or not,
I
it's
think
it's the game we're playing.
I think it can be uh, to to give like a I can understand why that bothers people at the same time, because I think you kind of grow up with that, you know, I don't know that this is necessarily the first discussion anymore, but like when my brothers were serving missions, there was like, the first discussion, and they kind of give you the foundational claims of the church,
Hmm.
that there was an apostasy, and then Joseph Smith restored it. And they list out these things. I think when you are in, primary level, and it is pretty cut and dry what it is. And you don't realize, I guess, that maybe some living leaders of the church are contradicting leaders that have were living a long time ago. And so you don't you don't realize that you're a cafeteria Mormon, because you kind of grow up thinking that you are a Mormon, and a Mormon is a Mormon. And you know what I mean? Like, it is what it is. I guess if that makes sense. So I can understand that perspective, but I guess I don't. It doesn't bother me. I guess I
I don't see a problem with recognizing the fact that people, to an extent, especially with a lot of religious claims, like I said before with my definition of faith, faith is being able to ascribe the divine to a specific experience or a specific set of information that we learn through experience, reason, or intuition. Um, Faith is being able to ascribe that, and there's always going to be a little bit of a variance between people, and
hmm
that variance is going to lead to people accepting different propositional truths, right?
hmm
And so I'm I try to give grace to people in that regard when I talk with them about, like, I mean, I can explain, hey, I believe the Book of Mormon is authentically true, but I also know the specific arguments that exist about it not being true. And even if I may find ways to reconcile that within myself, or I can find ways that I think correspond to reality to help support my case that the Book of
yeah,
Mormon is authentically ancient, I understand that, like I said, very intelligent people can come to very different conclusions. And I would never want to make somebody else feel inferior in some way to I would never want to make them feel inferior to me because they have come to a different conclusion. And I I have found that by taking that approach, I'm able to maintain connections with people who have left the church in a more easy way. And I find that it's a little bit, it kind of helps me relax a little bit too, because I relieve myself of that pressure of being able to prove that I'm right,
mm,
where I understand that everyone's kind of on a different journey, and I'm grateful for my faith, which allows me to say, even if I come to different conclusions than other people, I believe in an afterlife where everyone's eventually going to kind of be on the same page, or at least have the same information that I have, or maybe I get into the next life and I'm wrong and I have to correct some of my own beliefs. Um, I take comfort in knowing that my faith is resilient and robust in that way to where I can allow people to have disagreeing viewpoints from me
hmm
and still and not believe that they're going to rot in hell for all eternity for all intents and purposes.
right.
And
Actually, that's is I think a cool thing about Mormon theology or LDS theology is that um, there is that belief of the missionary work in the afterlife. That I don't feel like you have to like lose sleep as much as some other faiths. So, it's interesting. As you were talking about that, it reminded me of uh, when I was practicing. I I remember you'd have Sunday school lessons or something where you maybe had some disagreement on some theology, and
sure.
I remember the way I resolved it. It wasn't that I didn't think it mattered. Like I thought it mattered, whatever the dispute was. But I remember thinking it's okay to not know which one is right and just know that somebody's right. And it's an interesting thing to think about. But I didn't feel like those discussions or things ever hindered me from, incorporating what I learned in the lessons and classes and stuff, and then applying it and trying to live a better life and trying to become more like Christ. Like it never seemed to hinder my ability to live the gospel, to not have answers to everything, or the fact that people weren't sure which prophet was right. Was it the dead one, or, like, I don't know.
Well,
Yeah,
I have my own way of kind of reconciling why things change. I think Latter Day Saints get kind of hung up on the whole truth doesn't change thing
sure.
because we're not under an obligation to believe that we have all the truth right now,
Yeah.
and so the I'm more than open to the idea that we thought something was true, but in light of additional information that we have come to a different conclusion now. I think that's the
Mm,
whole premise behind modern revelation. And so I have no problem with those kinds of changes. And I get confused when people do have problems with those kinds of changes because in my view, every single change that has been incorporated, because we, again, we believe it comes from God,
Mm-hmm.
and we also believe that it is in light of these foundational sources where we realize that we believe something that does not correspond to reality.
Yeah.
And so we seek to correct that where we can. And I have found that the church has tried to be very good about being able to do that, at least for the most part. And,
Yeah.
like not accounting for like human frailty and all that. But
Yeah.
I am,
We definitely are going to have some disagreements there. I don't want to rehash the Jacob Hansen conversation.
how could you say that to me, Marty?
um, but I think, I think, I think it'd be worth at least voicing the problem with, I think that a lot of people that leave have is that the authority becomes kind of a sticky issue if when people say things with such confidence and then later they found out they were wrong about it, because then it leaves you back to the current moment and how much confidence you can give a current living prophet if it's possible that in the future they're going to learn something that is going to change the theology or change the the I would say the culture of the church or the way that people uh, understand the doctrine, like the changing the doctrine, right? I think growing up, I learned that the doctrine doesn't change, but policy does change or something. But it can, yeah.
It's so funny that you mentioned that because I don't have a problem with that at all.
You don't have a
And
problem with changing
well,
the
I
doctrine.
don't. And it would be for the reasons that I mentioned before, wherein I understand like the concern in the sense that I prophets are understood to be reliable, or they are understood to, when they talk about truth, truth doesn't change. But by necessity, circumstances and our tools do change over time. And
So,
I I have no problem accepting the idea that God would be able to manifest different truths over time using those different tools to help us arrive at a deeper conclusion, or a conclusion that more closely holds fast to the truth.
would you say it's fair to describe what you're saying as like maybe the prophet isn't the last, like something that the prophet says isn't necessarily unchanging, but it is the closest thing at this point in time that it's a good source of information for this point in time, given the information known to humanity or something like that.
In terms of, there's a really great quote given by Stephen L. Richards, who was an apostle back in like the 1930s, something
Mm-hmm.
like that. Yeah. In matters of church governance and discipline, the judgment of presiding officers is mandatory and controlling. In matters of individual guidance to members, their counsel is directory and persuasive only. In the interpretation of scripture and doctrine, they are dependent on their knowledge and experience. And I have found that to be a
Who
really
was that
great.
quote by? Sorry, say that again.
Stephen L. Richards. It
Oh.
was given in the 1932 April General Conference.
Mm-hmm.
And I have found that to be a really good model to view prophets and kind of their comments. So, to an extent, I sincerely doubt that any prophet in our theology has basically said anything I say over the pulpit is 100% true, not subject to change. Even some of our more fiery prophets, such as Brigham Young, I think there are a couple of quotes where he tried to take a more humble approach. Now, granted, there's a good case to be made that Brigham didn't necessarily feel like he needed to be corrected all the time, but at least in theory, I would say our theology has tried to explain prophets in such a way to where we we take as much truth as we can. We hold on to the truth that we have and gain more truth as we go. And if that means that over time we have to discard things that don't correspond to truth, then we we can discard the things that aren't as true as maybe we once thought they were. I
Mm-hmm.
would view things like not to be incredibly controversial, but I would view the priesthood ban as having happened very much like that, where you had different leaders at that time have a very specific conclusion that they've arrived at in regard to the biblical texts, and they said, this is what we understand about the nature of the world right now, and so we're going to enact a policy that corresponds to that. But over time, additional experience alongside additional information about like what the biblical texts, what they're understanding the biblical texts mean, when culture kind of got out of the way, God was able to use the tools that were at the prophet's disposal to be able to clarify and help people arrive at a conclusion that more closely corresponded to reality. And so, going back to your question about whether or not the prophets say that what a prophet says is like what most closely corresponds to truth, I would say yes and no in regard to yes, I believe that it more close it does it what the kind of line of prophets over time can lead us to most closely connect to God more than I would say other sources do. But I'm also not under the idea that just because something is said over the pulpit, that is necessarily exactly what God wills. And I don't think that our leaders would say that either. Or it's if nothing else, their principle, like the Stephen L. Richards quote, when it comes to like their own counsel, it's based on their it's supposed to be directory. It's their understanding based off of principles, and then they encourage us to live those principles and apply them in our lives, according to how inspiration necessitates. And
Mm-hmm.
so that was kind of a longer answer to your question. Maybe it was longer than you would have liked, but
No, it's I think it is something that Latter Day Saints have to grapple with, right?
yeah,
And so, and it, yeah, I think that you've given a perfectly perfectly good explanation. Um, I didn't realize how long we've been going.
we
It's
have been
gone by
going for a
fast.
while.
Um,
Can
I
I can I ask you a question? Can I turn the tables on you?
Yes, you can for sure. And then I
Okay.
have one more topic. I do want to talk a little bit about relationships a little bit, if you would be
Well, that's
interested in
that's
that
that's
too.
what I'm going to talk about.
Ah,
So,
sweet.
all right, so that we're on the same page. Um, so I'm going to tell a couple of stories, and I'm gonna be a little bit vulnerable here because this is a topic that is a little bit close to home for me. Like I said, I've been born and raised in the church. I've been a member of the church for almost my entire life. And well, I would say I have been a member of the church for my entire life. The only reason I add the qualifier almost is because I have had periods of time wherein I have seriously questioned whether or not I want to continue being a member of the church. But that does not change the fact that I've consistently had interactions with people outside of the church, or people who were my friends within the church, but then they come to a different conclusion, and it's almost as if they demand or expect me to agree with them, and my relationship with them is contingent upon me agreeing with them. So in the episode I did with Richie, I I talked a little bit about how a lot of my high school friend group, what they started out as being kind of members of the church, and over time they kind of had come to their own different conclusions, and they were still nice to me, but it was almost in a way to where I they were nice to me, and they wouldn't the second I said something that kind of like pushed back against them in a significant way regarding their beliefs, or but they consistently like quasi vitriolic kind of like tried to shut me down. And I don't know if I doubt sincerely it was their intention to do so, but it felt very much like my relationship with them was contingent upon me agreeing with them and basically saying that everything they did was good and it was okay.
It
And
was this. You said this started in high school. These were
yeah,
your during your high school years.
and this of course persisted even after that because I had a really close friend, and this is an interesting story, and I'm going to really make sure I present the information in such a way because they came out to me as non-binary. I don't know if they still do, but I'm just going to use pronouns in such a way to where I try to be respectful. I something like that. But they they came out to me as non-binary, and they basically asked, for all intents and purposes, do you believe me? And at that point, I hadn't done that much research into like the concept of gender, and I wanted to give it I wanted to give it a fair shake for all intents and purposes. And so I began looking on like university websites. I went on to like different articles. I listened to different commentators. And you and I are both fans of Jordan Peterson. And I actually really like Jordan Peterson's take on gender. Um, I think it corresponds to the data that exists rather well. But even then, when I tried my best to explain my thoughts to them, they, for all intents and purposes, they just cut me off. It was almost as if, again, going back to the same thing where it didn't matter what I said if I didn't 100% wholeheartedly share their propositional knowledge, for example, about the concept of gender and how it relates to biological sex or doesn't relate to biological sex, then I am a hateful bigot, and they just cut ties with me. And this has of course happened even closer within I see experience of this happening both inside and outside of my family. I've had people within my family, uh, they sometimes my relationship with them has been somewhat complicated by virtue of the fact that I've come to different conclusions with them about specific topics regarding LGBTQ plus stuff. And while I certainly try to be respectful and do absolutely everything I can to let them know that I love them, the fact I do not share propositional knowledge the same way that they do leads them to have said to me and to other members of my family that I'm I'm hateful, and I am, for all intents and purposes, I'm a bad person. And that's only, and to an extent, that's only been made worse as I've gotten, like, as I've kind of tried to immerse myself in the LDS theology space regarding what's true and what's not. Because I listen to members of the church, I listen to former members of the church get online and then say that, you know, we're paid apologists, and that we're pinheads, and that we're stupid, we're ignorant, and they wish that the apostles, you know, kick it for all intents and purposes. And I listen to them, and I just feel I feel incredibly hurt. And I I understand, logically speaking, that a lot of it does stem from their own hurt. And I don't want to discount the pain that they may have felt while leaving it, but it doesn't it I realize more and more every single day why it is difficult to maintain how and why it is difficult to maintain relationships across that border. Because I look at myself and I think, okay, I love these people. I I want to be the kind of person that's around for them for the rest of their lives, and for the rest I want them in my life. And it's hurtful when I listen to this rhetoric that's repeatedly getting passed around in post LDS circles, and also just kind of people who leave the church even when they're not associated with those circles. And I realize it's not just them. I realize that there are certainly examples of people inside the church saying things that I think do more to push people away than bring people together. But it doesn't change the fact that, to an extent, in my experience, I have felt really, really hurt by former members of the church who consistently ascribe bad emotions, bad intentions, and they ascribe labels to me that I don't think fit. And I I guess one of the things I want to ask you is, what am I doing wrong? Is How do we solve this problem?
There is a really great um, book called Feeling Good by David Burns.
Okay.
And it's a book that helps. I think I got it from Jonathan Haidt or his co-author on one of his books that he did, and he highly recommended it. He was suicidal and read David Burns' book, and it helped him get out of some cognitive cycles that were making him suicidal. And anyways, I was looking for that book, not because I was suicidal, but because I thought, hey, if this is going to help everyone, let's, because I think that's how he sold it. He's like, anybody could read this book and it would improve things. And so looking for that book, I came across Feeling Good Together. And David Burns basically does thought experiments. He'll do like classes, group classes, and he's talking about relationships. And when you go to one of his classes, you could have someone in mind that you're trying to build a relationship with, whether it's like a spouse or anybody, like a friend or a extended family member. And I think any of the things that you learn in that book, you could apply to any relationship. Makes you wonder if you could apply it to online personalities. I have skepticism that that would work for different reasons, because online personalities are not real people. So I have it, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Well,
Maybe
you're
that's
an
a mean
online
thing. Maybe
personality. Does
that's
that mean you're real?
maybe, maybe that's a mean thing to say. Um, I have a goal to get along with people, so I think I could get along with anybody. When I see how some of the online personalities interact, it makes me sad because I'm like, no, you guys need to talk to each other and talk about each other like you would if they were in the room, and they don't do that. And so that's why I feel like it's a little bit harder. They're almost talking to their echo chamber and not to each other very well, which is why I think that some of those online personality interactions, it's hard to have a good relationship there. Um, I got diverged a little bit. So David Burns has like a thought experiment that he
Okay.
gives his classes. And he says, if you could push a button right now and you could push that button and have a good relationship with this person, would you push it? And there's a bunch of people in the class that realized they wouldn't push the button, even if it was zero work. They had to do nothing. All they had to do was push a button. And so basically, the person that they're talking about, they believe are, I'm going to swear here, they believe that they're, how do you have a good relationship with someone you don't want to have a good relationship with, because either you don't feel like they deserve it or you really just don't want it in the first place. And then there was another one where he asks people like whose fault it is. I think like who is a bad relationship, who is more in fault, and everyone raises their hand, says it's the other person, and he's skeptical that that's the case. And so basically you're not able to move forward in the book if you can't, and it's okay if you decide that they're a person that they're not worth having a relationship with. That's fine. He's not saying that you have to have a good relationship with them, but you can't continue wondering why you don't have a good relationship
Right.
if you don't want to have a good relationship with them. And then the other thing is, are you willing to take on the blame? Are you willing to take on the responsibility for having the good relationship? So like with some of the online interactions, I kind of wonder if someone would step up and be the bigger person, let the other person take a few shots at them publicly, give them the benefit of the doubt, don't respond to it. Like if someone were to be the bigger person in one of those scenarios, would then it be reciprocated? And I think in most cases, I think it might be, but that's just my hope. And in a lot of the situations that you were talking about, it's like a more in-person relationship, right? You don't even have the dynamic with online. And that's heartbreaking. And I don't, like, I'm not a psychologist or anything, so I don't feel like I have the room to be like, yeah, you can have a good relationship with anybody, because maybe you can't. I guess I just have the hope that people can. And I do believe that people, um, I do believe that people throw in the towel earlier than they need to, for sure. Um, and I was and I was just thinking about like some of your relationships with people, um, on in your side of things. The only thing you can do is give them the benefit of the doubt that they're going through a very hard thing and it's a temporary thing, and then hopefully giving them a little bit of time and space. Then you could try to rekindle that relationship maybe later down the road. I think one thing that people that leave don't understand is how hard it is for I think they do understand. It's hard to recognize that things that are hard for other people when you're going through something hard. Um,
Yeah.
and so I do think though, uh, people that leave are not patient. I was talking to RFM, and we never, when I interviewed RFM, he never said this recorded. I don't think he would mind me saying this because we were planning on saying it and then we just never got to it. But
Hmm.
he came to a similar conclusion that I did, which is that as a person that leaves the church, you know what it's like to be a member. So you kind of have the higher responsibility to maintain relationships, because you know what it's like to be a member, but the person that's a member doesn't know what it's like to leave. And so I kind of agree with that. I remember having that thought as I left, is that if I want to have a good relationship with someone, I need to treat them in a way that I know would not be hurtful from the perspective that I once had. That being said, for people that have not left the church, they might not realize how disorienting it is to lose your grip of reality, basically, as you have a collapse of belief. And it's not, I mean, there are certain choices that you make to be open to, coming to different conclusions, and you definitely have your own actions involved, but it is almost something that happens to you. Like it's you have like a collapse of a worldview, and that's why I like to say that instead of a faith crisis, because I actually think it takes a lot of faith to step into the unknown and follow what to to investigate something that you think might not be true, like
Oh, I
something
would
that
agree.
you grew
I would
up with, right?
absolutely agree with that.
Yeah,
There's absolutely to an extent it goes back to what we were talking about before, right? Where we're
yeah,
ascribing we are consciously making a decision to ascribe things in a completely different way, and you have to do that with a ton when you step away from the church or just from religion in general. So
hmm,
I would absolutely agree with that.
yeah. And so, I guess, eh, the only way that you maintain those relationships is when you give someone the benefit of the doubt. And I think hurtful things are said a lot from both directions, and you have to either view it from their perspective to not be offended, or you have to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're hurting, and that's why things are being said. At the same time, like, I wouldn't encourage anyone to be beat down in any kind of relationship, right? Like, if it's a relationship not worth happening, maybe that doesn't need to be evaluated or something. But I feel like people are far too willing to say, cut off your family, your closest relationships, and I'll be your family. I think that sounds culty to me, and I hear it in the ex-Mormon spaces a lot. So, um, I don't know. The, I think your most stable relationships are your kin, and I wouldn't just throw that away, because you can make new friends for sure, but you can't make a new mom or dad. So,
Well
um,
said.
I don't know. Not to say that I'm sure there are relationships out there where maybe that relationship is not worth having, or it's good to like give yourself some space, but um, I think that advice is given out more than it should be. But that's just my perspective, I guess. I don't know. Um,
So let me
so
just make sure I understand it correctly. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but
no, you're good.
so I really like those thought experiments you brought up. So the button one where you have a good relationship, and the second one was the would you be willing to put forth that effort?
Yeah, like whose fault
Yeah,
do you think it
whose fault is
is?
that? You're right. You're
Right.
right. That was what you said. The I also really like not ascribing permanence to their desire not to not to ascribe permanence to it.
Hmm.
I think that that's something that uh, I think that's something that's a trap that people who are both members and non-members of the church can fall into.
Yeah.
Um, I also think there's a degree of that's humility. That there's humility that's inherent within that,
Yeah.
right? We go, if we're taking this full circle, I would never want to say that somebody isn't as smart as I am for coming to a different conclusion. So by necessity, I have to recognize, or I'm making the conscious decision to ascribe their decisions as being of, I don't know if I I want to say equal value, but of course, if somebody is like leaves the church and then I'm not saying that that's what everyone does, but if somebody leaves the church and then makes decisions that are going to like harm people around them, I don't know if that's a good thing. But
Right.
and so we have to make some kind of value judgment to the decisions that they're making when they leave the church, or if they stay in the church.
Hmm.
But inherently, we have to what we should do is we should ascribe every single person as having an equal value. And when we choose to ascribe as other people as having an equal value regardless of where they may be at, I think it will become easier to maintain that kind of relationship. And that's what I refer to when I refer to as humility, where I don't esteem myself to be better than the other person.
Yeah. And I also think it's important to focus. I think sometimes one thing that's hard, especially if you had a relationship that was the thing that you brought you together was the church, and you no longer have that in common. It's important to focus your relationship on things that you still do have in common. David Osler, his book Bridges, I felt like was really, really good. Um, and one of the things, I think he pulled this from another source, but that's where I learned it. So I'll just give him credit. But I think it was a 5-to-1 ratio of like positive interactions to like more heavy interactions. And so if you're going to have a conversation about church doctrine and you disagree on that, then maybe that should only be like 1 in 5 conversations that you're having with this person. And the other conversations should be light and positive, so that, I mean, psychologically, so that you want to be around them more, right? Like you have to, I mean, and that's something I realized pretty early on when I was talking. We told our family pretty early. I know a lot of people that leave will just kind of keep it to themselves and quietly try to not address the elephant in the room. We did not go that route, and I had a lot of heavy conversations with my dad, and they were pretty negative, and our relationship was going south pretty quick. And I realized, getting advice from books that I was listening to and stuff, I was like, I had the epiphany that I needed to focus on what we still had in common. And I and I was like, okay, what do we have in common? Like, actually, like, what do we have in common? This is such a big part of what we had in common that we don't have anymore. What do we have in common? And I was like, well, he's my dad, and I love him, and he loves me. That familial bond we still have in common. And so I tried to focus on that, and tried to let him know that I loved him, like that hasn't changed, and that helped things a lot. So um yeah. So I don't know. There's
It's tricky.
I think, yeah, and I think people, your own situation. The only thing I can do is maybe give ideas and support, and I'm hopeful that people can have better relationships with people. But ultimately, they're going to have to experiment with these things in their own life, and I'm hopeful that things can be better. I always and I always encourage the online personas to have the relationships across different divides too. It feels like it goes on deaf ears, but it is what it is.
Yeah, and
There's some pretty
that's
strong feelings.
yeah, there is, and I'm not blind to it. And in a lot of my research, I listen to a lot of the online personalities who aren't LDS anymore,
Uh,
and I could because I want to understand where they're coming from. And you didn't get to this part in the interview, but to an extent, there's a part of me that sees I'm like, hey, I'm 23.
yeah,
If I was to learn that the church isn't true, now would be a very good time for me to do it.
Uh-huh.
And so it's kind of a joke, but I am genuinely interested in what causes people to leave the church. It's one
Mhm.
thing that I wish there was better data on,
Mm.
admittedly, because there are a few
Have
different
you read
studies.
David Osler's book?
No, I haven't.
I think that answers he tries to answer that question that you just
Okay.
asked. And I will say that when I read his book, and he's a Latter-day Saint. When I read his book, I felt like I felt understood. I felt like there's a lot of times where members will say why people leave, and you're like, you're not getting it, you're not understanding this, like you're way off. But he seemed to at least get closer. I think a lot of people don't necessarily think he got it perfectly, but I felt like he did really good. So,
Well, and that's good. It's a good resource for me because, to be fair, even in like John DeLynn did a study back in like 2012, 2013, something like that,
mm,
that talked about why people leave the church and why people disbelieve. And one of the statistically significant factors, if I was reading the study correctly, one of the statistically significant factors was a desire to sin. It wasn't super, super significant in the sense it didn't affect it all that much,
mm-hmm.
but it was a statistically significant desire that got mentioned. And it was tricky because at that point I'm like, this could be, I can understand why people might get confused about this sort of thing, because I would hate for somebody to look at that specific data set and say, oh well, people just only leave the church because they want to do sinful and bad things and evil and blah.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's more complicated than that a lot of the time. I think it's a combination of factors, but I I think there's something to be said about being willing to listen to what other people have to say. But it makes it difficult for me as someone who does believe to want to listen to what other people have to say when I'm being told consistently I'm a part of the cult. I'm part of a cult and the devil's sock puppet. And or that's a legitimate thing, by the way. I have been called the devil's sock puppet,
Oh
and
dear.
I'm not going to let it go because it's as funny as it is indicative of kind of how people can view the other person across the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And or even on like the that's more of like the general Christian people who say that we're evil and like bad and possessed by the devil, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, even on like the more kind of agnostic atheist criticism side, we of course they have the implication that um, we're of course not engaging in good faith. We're actively hiding people. We're the worst kinds of people.
Mm-hmm.
We're big and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I find it difficult for me to want to listen to people who are consistently telling me that that's the case. And I don't think that. So from an economic standpoint, if for nothing else, if you want to be more effective, don't say I'm a jerk all the time and
Well,
forever. But the
I have a theory on that.
okay, I'd be interested to hear your theory.
They're not talking for you, they're talking for their tribe. And their tribe
Um,
likes hearing stuff like that. It makes you go, yeah. So, um, yeah, you have to recognize who their audience is. Their audience is not you.
that is a cold comfort, Marty. Admittedly, I that it makes sense. That
At
doesn't
least they
mean
have
I.
an audience. I don't have one. So I think
well,
we got disconnected for a
well,
minute.
all I was saying is I respect. No, you're just fine. I was just saying I respect you for being willing to talk with people who disagree with you, and I'm sure we could hash out all the reasons. And obviously, I would be right, but
Sure.
that was a joke, by the way, in case your viewers didn't get that. Um, but I, you're probably right in the sense that relationships go both ways. Both people should be willing and have that desire to press the button to have a good relationship, so to speak, and be willing to like take the initiative on that. And there are instances where I look back on my life and say I did a good job of doing that, and there are instances where I can look back on my life and say I probably could have done better.
Right.
But I in the church we talk about faith, hope, and charity. And faith and charity. Well, charity, of course, is like the favorite child of those three. With faith is like being the middle child, and then you have the like the least focused on, which is hope. I think that's been my experience at least.
Yeah.
But hope is probably one of the most important principles we can apply in this sort of thing. Where as I reach out to other people who disagree with me, I can have hope that it might make a difference. It might not, but if I hold on to that hope, it can give me the motivation and the courage to be able to press the button and be able to have those difficult conversations, but also be able to meet people where they're at. And I think that hope and humility would do everyone a lot of good in terms of being able to maintain good relationships and you know maybe help people along the way.
Yeah. I think your ideology or your religious preference or wherever you are, I don't think those are the lines between good and bad people, or people that you want to be like and people you don't want to be like. And so it's really easy, I think, uh, it's a really easy game to play to compare another group's worst with my group's best. And I think just to understand that um, yeah, there's people that you'd want to admire or you'd want to be like, uh, regardless of their. You want to you want to learn from as many places as possible. So,
Sure. And I would say
yeah,
if you are a member of the church, you should be doing that. I would say that I would appeal to things like the 13th article of faith, and I would appeal to several statements given by other leaders. And I would say, listen, we should really be taking seriously people with different viewpoints. And to be fair, I think there was something to be said about a lot of the maybe Latter Day Saints have inherited a hermeneutic of suspicion in regard to people outside the church. Because to be fair, the people and members of the church do have a history of being shot at,
mhm,
and so maybe some of that is carrying down. And I mean, the church is still a relatively young organization, all things
hmm,
considered, and that sort of thing kind of takes time to work itself out.
yeah,
And I would be willing to give grace and patience to members of the church in that regard. But I I'm hopeful, right? I hope that conversations like the ones we're having right now can one day become the norm, and we we can eventually arrive at the point where people can accept the idea that people disagree and not take that and not assume malintent, and also not assume that people are acting in bad faith or are just dumb.
yeah.
And I think if we do that, it would solve a lot of the problems that I think you and I are both seeing in terms of being able to talk across the divide.
I agree. Yeah, I think there's no matter where you're at, there's always room for growth and being a better listener. And I think that's something a lot of people struggle with. And and I think it's good to hope for, yeah, better stuff. As far as online goes, I am not hopeful. I should be. I'm not super hopeful. The things that get the attention is not this kind of conversation. I don't know what to do about that because um, it's
Well,
interesting because I think like a conversation, for example, between like Jacob Hansen and John Dolan or something like that would get a lot of eyeballs. So I don't understand why there isn't more. Um, I don't know. I don't know why there's isn't more. Why that's not higher on people's priority list. And I think honestly, when you look at what John Dolan's doing with his content and stuff, he probably has a list of all of the projects that he wants to work on. And I'm sure that a conversation like that is on his list. It just never gets it to the top of the list. I can say other examples too. I know that I was really impressed with Bill Real and Jacob Hansing having those series of conversations. They seem to stop abruptly. I don't know the backstory on there. It's too bad that that stopped.
Well,
I was enjoying those.
I
um,
it was interesting.
so
I think both of them were expecting the conversation to go differently than it did.
mm, yeah,
And I to your point, I also think there's a degree of you were talking about like why these conversations aren't more common. There's
with
probably
the
a
bigger
degree of
names, right?
with
Like,
the bigger names, yeah.
yeah,
I think there's a degree of in group out group a little bit of the play. You were talking about tribes earlier.
hmm
Um, it's it's easy to label, and you're more likely to get people to agree with you when you take kind of the in group and out group approach, where we are the strong and righteous, and we are the correct people with
hmm
a capital T truth, and then either those members or non-members of the church are if you're a non-member of the church, you say, well, those believe, the people who do believe are just bigoted and hateful, and they're deceiving themselves and that sort of thing. Or even
hmm
maybe members of the church may take an extreme approach and say, like, everybody who leaves the church is inherently evil, and we should avoid them at all costs. And I don't think that either of those approaches are sustainable, and I don't think it would lead to good conclusions. And I so what you're noticing is probably a degree of we're fighting against psychology a little bit,
yeah,
and hopefully, if we set a trend, though, if we can continue to hope, and if we can continue to make a difference, or we hope that a difference can be made by those, even just the little conversations, right?
yep,
Where we continue to reach across the divide. If we can make this the norm, then I think, if nothing else, the problem will be mitigated, maybe not fully resolved, but maybe we can circumvent it enough to the point to where, at least in our current day-to-day lives, we can get around a lot of that in group out group dynamic that we're seeing.
yeah. And it would be nice if you could learn how to maybe have a conversation where you're disagreeing fundamentally, even, and you're not just able to have that relationship because you're not talking about the elephant in the room. Like, maybe those elephants can be addressed and you can maintain a good relationship. I think that's the tricky part, because what I find is you will see conversations across different divides, but they usually spend time talking about only what they agree on and then never what they disagree on. And while that's still good to have to humanize disagreeers, I think it's also important to learn how to have a, a conflict too, without,
How to disagree without being disagreeable.
yeah. Because I mean, you can't just not address them. I think you get better information and stuff when you fully understand at least why you're disagreeing. That would be better. So, yeah. Well, I have taken a lot of your time, so I'll
Well,
let you.
I've really enjoyed it, Marty, so I don't want you to feel bad. That's not allowed.
Oh, good. I appreciate your time, and I'll point people. I'll make sure I put your series playlists in the description so people can find you.
Yeah.
And not all people associated with fair are terrible. See?
That's if that's the takeaway you get from this, then I will know that I have succeeded, at least in part. Because I mean, hopefully I've been able to show that I can listen, or at least I try to.
Yeah.
And I want to meet people where they're at. And if you want to reach out to me, you can reach out to me by my fair email. That's zwright@fairlatterdaysaints.org. So you can email me if you want to like chat with me. You can also like message me on Facebook. I'm typically good at responding.
Okay.
But yeah, just you can check out my content over at Fair. You can just take a look at some of their content if you have additional questions about kind of churches. I'm sure you and your viewers already know what the purpose of Fair is, but I if people want to talk to me, they certainly can, and you can find me over with Fair.
Oh,
At least for now. We'll have to.
unless you get so many emails that you just don't have the time to respond, right?
Yes, which may or may not be a possibility, but we'll see.
Okay. Well, I'll make sure I put your email in the description too.
That works out great. And again, Marty, thank you for talking with me. You've given me a lot of good stuff to think about, and I appreciate your insights.
Well, thank you for joining me. So, anyway, have a great night.
You too.